Before we get started, just a couple of house rules points. Number one, this session is going to be recorded. And also, everyone is going to be in listen-only mode. You have a chat window that you can ask the questions. We encourage you to ask the questions during the session. So by the end of the session, if you have a couple of minutes, we can answer these questions. We're going to start in a few minutes to give a chance for everyone to join the session. Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Team Canada's Tech Thursday session. My name is Wylan Waisri. I am the sales engineer for WatchGuard Canada. And today we're going to be talking about high availability to solution for WatchGuard Fireboxes. In our agenda today, we're going to talk about cluster versus DR or disaster recovery and the differences between them and when to use each one of them. We're going to talk about the different configuration that is possible with the firewall, which is active-passive versus active-active configurations. We're also going to talk about what are the supported models for FireCluster, what are the requirements for the cluster when it comes to the hardware, software, design, and planning. And then we're going to take a look at what are the steps required for configuring the FireCluster itself. And then after that, we will take a look at how to monitor and control the FireCluster members in case if I need to test the failover. And the last thing we're going to be talking about is related to FireCluster and WatchGuard Cloud, which is related to the monitoring of the FireCluster and what are the differences when it comes to adding the FireCluster in the cloud for monitoring. And definitely, if we have a few minutes at the end, we're going to take a couple of questions if that's possible. All right, so let's get started here and take a look at the definition of what is a disaster recovery and what is a cluster or high availability and the relationship between these terms. So when it comes to the disaster recovery, usually DR is generally a replacement of the entire data center. Let's say that you have multiple data centers, or that you have an HQ and you have another site that you want to have everything replicated there in case the first one is not available. So this kind of replacement, it can be physical or virtual. Right? It depends on the applications that you have, as opposed to high availability, which is typically deals with faults in a single component that is related to a CPU or a single hardware like the firewall, rather than the complete failure of all IT infrastructure because of catastrophe or a disaster, right? It's in the name in there. So when you're talking about DR, if you said, hey, I have HQ and I have another site that I want to create in case the first one there's a disaster, then we can use the second one. Then we're going to talking about DR kind of configuration. And the disaster recovery itself, when it comes to the site, it has different ways. It depends on the budget, depends on the need for a quick, failover from the first location to the second, and so on. So you could have a cold site that it's usually little or no equipment. There's no network connectivity. It's not ready for automatic failover. There's no data synchronization, and you have a high risk of data loss, but it's the cheapest, right? Maybe you can actually have a cold site that just have a firewall just in there that is not turned on, and whenever that it's needed, then you can go and configure it. Worm site, that it's partially redundant equipment. There's a network connectivity that is enabled already. The failover is going to occur within hours or days, daily or weekly data synchronization. So this is something to take into account once that you set the first site and the second site, how you're going to replicate the data when it comes to your servers, services, databases, and so on. Can be happening on a weekly basis. It's minimum data loss and it's cost effective. But if you require something that it is up quickly, then most probably that you will have a firewall that it is on the second site of the disaster recovery site that is already fully configured, fully connected to the internet, and the synchronization happen on an hourly basis or less when it comes to your databases. And it's near real-time data synchronization, right? Zero data loss, but this is the most expensive one, because whatever that when it comes to the server and services that you have on the main side, you have to actually replicate it on the secondary one, right? If we're going to go to this route, please remember, most of the time you are not talking about that, hey, I'm going to have an active passive once, and the main site is going to have the active and the passive is going to be on the disaster recovery. It doesn't work that way, right? Because when it comes to the synchronization between the two, there's a lot of requirements. One of them that they have to be, they look that they are in the same LAN. It has to be less than 100 millisecond when it comes to the failover. Everything in behind the firewall, it has to be replicated exactly. The IP addresses, for the external interfaces have to follow. So it's almost impossible to do it. There's, some locations that they done that, but usually they're gonna own. Let's say that it's two building. There's a 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers between them. There's a fiber that is connecting the two sites. Then maybe there is a possibility that you can go with the active passive in that scenario. But it requires a lot of design, a lot of testing when it comes to the failover. Right, so moving on here, we're going to talk about high availability. So high availability, it can be a component of the disaster recovery, but mainly here, and this is with the focus of what we're going to talk about today, it's that I have these devices in the same rack, right? So we will see that we can do active passive or active active, and you have the ability to configure these two firewalls to be installed and used in failover configuration. That's the main reason of having them there. Redundancy provides the redundancy necessary to ensure that the maximum network uptime, and clustering refers to linking these two devices that function as a single logical unit. You're going to think about it that way. So as you can see, this is just an example. Definitely, you can have everything in redundant format or configuration, but mainly here you have your router. It's going to go to a switch. You have two firewalls that we have the connectivity between them to do the clustering and cluster synchronization. You can actually make use here, if it's active passive, you can make use of link aggregation that it's going to the external interface, and anything that member one is connected to for the external, the internal, it has to be also replicated, connected to the second member that we have in here. Right, so moving on here, we will take a look at the difference between the active passive and active active. After we understood that what we are talking about in here is the high availability when it comes to clustering, it's on the same side. We are not talking about the disaster recovery side. So when it comes to the active passive cluster, so this is another example that we have in here. An active passive cluster, one cluster member is going to be active and the other one is passive. It's from the name itself. And one of the things that to take into consideration here, that to make this more viable and it's cheaper when it comes to the implementation, the first device here that is going to be the active device, you need to, let's say that you want to have total security on it, so you have to pay total security feature key, right? The second one, you just can get it for us, for a fraction of the price for the hardware, and just you need to have a standard support on it. The feature key, if it's an active passive, it's going to be shared between them. It's going to be applied or used by which one that's going to be active depending on the scenario. So the active cluster member handles all the network traffic unless a failover event occurs. And this, it depends on the condition. Sometimes it's taking a look at the total health, criteria for each one of them. So if the first one, the health criteria about it, that maybe it's overloaded, maybe there's an issue in the buffering, then it can fail over to the second one, or maybe it's the hardware availability itself related to, there's a hardware failure, then it can fail over to the second one. The passive cluster member actively monitors the status of the active device. This is why we have that link between them, and it can be actually two links for synchronization and monitoring for the heartbeat. So if the active device fails, then the passive device takes over the connection assigned to the failed device. This is why you have a virtual MAC address. For the other devices, it sees it as a logical unit. All right, so that was the active passive, and that was, most of the time, that's the one that I recommend using for your high availability configuration for the firewall. There's another option that it's available, which is used much less than, active passive. For the active cluster, the cluster members share the traffic that passes through the cluster, and it's going to distribute these connections between the active and the passive. We're going to do the configuration to use either round robin or the least connections, depending on what is the requirements in here. If one member of the cluster fails, then the other cluster member takes over the connection assigned to the failed member, right? Some people say, why not go to the active from the beginning, right? It depends on your scenario here. Do you really need the active? Because with active, you need more configuration for the switches in front and the back. Sometimes you need to do load balancing, ahead of time. You have to take in consideration all the extra steps that need to be done when it comes to the configuration. Also, when you size the firewall, let's say this is firewall that it is for 60 devices. When you have it in active, you're not gonna actually double that number of saying, hey, this is gonna be actually have the double number of connections, or we're gonna double the number of devices that is gonna be supported. Most of the time, if you have both of them, because of the overhead, because of the synchronization that's gonna happen, you're gonna add, around 30, maybe 40%, of extra processing power for that device. So in older days, maybe that made sense that you have, two devices because one device cannot handle the traffic. But it's much better that you get a larger size when it comes to a different model, and you have it in active passive instead of having it in active configuration. So when you configure the FireCluster in active, the cluster uses a multicast MAC address for all interfaces that send the network traffic. So this is a differentiator from how the active and the differ from the active passive. So before you enable FireCluster, for the active, make sure that the network switches, routers, other devices are configured to route the network traffic with multicast MAC addresses. Usually this is going to be layer 3 switch, so you have to upgrade that in the front and the back of the firewall. So there's an extra cost to it, and extra step that's need to be done. Okay, so what about the criteria here when it comes to the failover, right? So when a cluster member fails, the cluster seamlessly fails over and maintain the following. So the packet filter connections, the site-to-site tunnels for VPN, the user sessions, the access portal user sessions, all of that is gonna be seamlessly failing from the first to the second. But there are some of the things that actually it will kind of reset or disconnect, right? Even though the synchronization is there, but for some of them that you notice that there was a drop for a couple of seconds, right? So proxy connections is one of them. The mobile VPN connections that you'll see that you've been disconnected is you have the auto connection, then it will auto connect again. The RDP and SSH connection initiated through access portal is going to be disconnected, and also mobile VPN users might have to manually restart the VPN, right? So these are things that you have to take into consideration. But the worst case scenario here, it's going to take it a couple of seconds to fail over from the first to the second, and after that, it's just going to be to restart the VPN. So it's not going to be that it will be for hours that you are trying to reconnect again. Now, what about the cluster roles? It's important to understand that we have the master and the backup. So the cluster member assigns the network flows to the cluster members and responds to all the requests from the external system, like for example WSM, SNMP, DHCP, ARP, all the routing when it is actually the cluster master. So when you configure or modify the cluster configuration, you save the cluster configuration to the cluster master first, and then the cluster master can synchronize it to the second one. It can be the first device in a cluster to power or become the cluster master, right? So this is one of the things that to take into consideration. And anyway, we will go through the requirements to find out they have to be, twinned, right? When it comes to the hardware, they have to be the same model, the same operating system. So it doesn't matter which one actually of them is the master at that moment, or they're gonna fail over. For the backup master, this cluster member synchronizes all the necessary information with the cluster master, so it can become the cluster master in case the first one fails, right? The backup can be active or passive, right? So in some scenario that it can be both down, they are active, right? So in case that you did an active, this is another issue with active, that when you actually, they are back up to each other, even though that they're doing the load sharing between each other, you get a little bit of extra processing power. But let's say when you you size it, oh, this is for 60 devices, and now that I have 100 devices with the active, they're still backup for each other. So if one of them fails, it still cannot handle the 100. It's going to be only handling 60, right? So this is something that to be taken into consideration. I know this is a long list, but I just wanted to, pinpoint the some of the limitations that's related to the FireCluster once that you do the configuration. So for example, here for active cluster, you cannot configure the network in a bridge mode or drop-in mode. And anyway, some people they are aware of this, or some people not. But we have different type like bridge mode, drop-in mode, and the routing mode or route mode, right? Which is the default. For an active passive cluster, you cannot configure the network in bridge mode. For the active, you cannot configure the external interface to use PPOE or DHCP. So this is something to take into consideration, right? Sometimes that you will have, some kind of a router from Bell or Rogers that it's require PPOE, to be configured on the external interface. So if you're going for the active, you have also to talk to your ISP to have something that's going to be static IP address assigned directly to the interface. You cannot configure IPv6 addresses or enable DHCP version 6 server on the interface. Also, you cannot configure IPv6 dynamic routing protocols. The FireCluster for the wireless devices, let's say that you had one of these devices tabletop with a W, right, which has wireless in it. So if you have a wireless device, it can be configured only in active passive. You cannot configure it in active. For an active cluster, you cannot configure link aggregation interfaces. Another thing to take into consideration, because again, whenever that you do it in active, it's gonna add more load on the device or the firewall for the load balancing, so that you lose some of the features in there. Access portal is supported for active passive only. It doesn't work with active. And also for the modem interfaces are not supported for the FireCluster failover. So these are some of the points that it's available. Now, when it comes to the supported models for the FireCluster, so definitely to do the configuration, you must have 2 devices that supported model. So FireCluster is fully supported in all the firewall or XTM devices. There's a couple of exceptions. So if you have T10 and T15 devices, they are not supported. But if you have T20, it is supported. Firebox V and XTMV devices support active passive only in VMware ESXi environment. So this is something to take into consideration. So if you want to go with a virtual firewall and you are using VMware on ESXi, then you cannot actually have it in active. It's only active passive. And on Hyper-V and KVM, it is actually FireCluster is not supported at all, right? So you have to take that into consideration. Okay, so what are the requirements for the cluster? First here is the general requirement, and I talked about this before, is the network latency between the cluster members must be less than 100 milliseconds, right? So this is why what I said that if you have them in two different locations, there's nothing impossible. It's always there is a way if you're good at your routing and design, and you have maybe fiber between them or a VPN, or they are both of them in the same cloud location. Then maybe it's possible to be done. But usually these kind of sophisticated design is not supported, from our support. We are talking about, most of the time it's going to be the active passive configuration. Now, network mode requirements to configure the active passive cluster, your network interfaces must be configured in mixed routing or drop-in mode. To configure the active cluster, the network interfaces must be configured in mixed routing mode, right? You cannot have it in drop-in mode. And also, we already mentioned that the FireCluster and active doesn't support bridge network mode. Also, when it comes to the fireware or feature keys and the license requirement, make sure that the same version of the fireware is installed on each firebox, right? So if you receive the second one just now and you already have the first one ahead of time, then you have to make sure that they match, right, when it comes to the operating system. Make sure you have the feature key for each firebox saved in a local file. That it's going to save you, the problems of trying to connect again to the internet, finding where is the file. It's better that you save it on your laptop so that it's going to be accessible when you are doing the configuration. So for active cluster, all fireboxes must have active license for the same optional subscription services. So it's either that you go, hey, I want with basic security or total security, and it has to match through both. So this is another thing about active. When you want to go active, then both of them have to have licensing. So it's going to be more expensive, right? Compared to active passive that you need to pay for one license, and the second one is just standard support. All right. Other things that's related to the requirement, the hardware and cable requirement, make sure that you have two activated fireboxes with the same model number. Right. So if you have one is T35, the other one T40, definitely you cannot cluster that. Also, the same interface modules installed in each firebox, right? Because we have the new models now that all of them have this extra slot. Yeah, they have to match. And you cannot say one of them I want to have fiber, the other one is just going to be a gigabit interface, a normal one. So they have to match on both of them. An Ethernet cable for each cluster interface. You can use a straight or crossover cable. No worries about that. One network switch for each enable trusted optional custom or external interface that you have. Most of the time that we will have one in front, one in the back. There is a possibility. This is again, it's a switching choice. You can have everything in one switch, right? And you have different VLANs depending on the port-based VLAN. Ethernet cables to connect the interfaces of both devices to the network switches, this goes without saying. Now, before you can configure the FireCluster, you must make sure that the external interface configuration is compatible with the type of the FireCluster of your choice. So if you're going with the active, each external interface must have a static IP address. I wanted to make this clear because some people, they don't pay attention to this point. They go with active. Sometimes they have PPOE in there or one of them, and it doesn't work. Active passive FireCluster each external interface must have static IP address, or it can be configured as triple PoE or DHCP. All right, so that was a quick look here in relation of what are the requirements. So what's the configuration? And the one that I'm going to focus on here, because this is the first one that we have related to the high availability, we're going to just have an active passive where we have the router, the switch, in the front and the back. We're going to have one or two connections between the two so that we will do the synchronization. So the requirements here, we need to use the Ethernet cable to connect the primary cluster interface on one Firebox to the primary cluster interface on the second one. You can have two, by the way, so that it's recommended also to have a backup cluster interface in there. Just in case if the first one, it has a faulty port or a faulty cable, then you have the second one. If you have a network interface available, we recommend that you connect definitely the backup cluster interface. Connect the external interface of each firewall to the network switch or VLAN. If you use multi-WAN, connect the second external interface of each firebox to another network switch. So again, this is switching, design issue. So depending on your design, that you're going to have the switch, you're going to have the connectivity for everything that you have behind the firewall, going to different, zones or the trust zones that you have. It has to match on both of the devices. Connect the trusted interface of each device to the internal network switch or VLAN, which is we just talked about. And for each firewall, connect other trusted or option network interfaces to the internal network switch of that firebox. So, in summary, if I go back here to my network diagram, it's that you have the switch here, whatever that you have in the trust interface, and here it has only one connection, right? But the main idea that if you have Ethernet 1 here that is being used for the trust, it has to be connected to the switch. Same thing for the member 2 that is going to lead us to that same trusted network. So seamlessly, if first one is failed, then the second one have the same connectivity. All right. Now, here's the one that I'm gonna do the demo for, right? That we will actually use two cluster interfaces for doing the synchronization, and we're gonna use a management interface that it's actually the trust interface, right? So one of the things here that comes to the recommendation that for these, the primary and the backup cluster interfaces, most of the time we use interface 5 and interface 6. It can be other interfaces if you want. We can use the IP address 169.254 on them, so we don't want any conflict with any other 172 or 10 network or 192 network and so on. So you can actually set it that it will match the interface number and the member number. So here, the first one is going to be interface 5 on member 1, right? And this one here, it's going to be the second one, right? So it's interface 5 on member 2. When it comes to the other interface, it's going to be interface 6 on member 1, interface 6 on member 2. And for the management interface, I put an IP address in here in the same trust network. So I put it as 10.0.10.100 for the first one and 102 in the second. And by the way, this information, it's all available in the help document, right? This is where I got it from. So what we're going to do next is that definitely we need both of the firewall up and running. And we need both of them to be the same model. And also when it comes to the operating system, I already updated both of them to 12.7.1. The configuration will be done via Wizard on the primary unit. And once that we've done all of that, and definitely if we want the second device to be automatically discovered, then we're gonna actually wait for the saving the configuration on the first one until the second one is up and running, right? Now, one of the things that you will notice about the second one, that once that we upgraded to the operating system the same 12.7.1, we needed to be in a factory default settings. So once that we connect to the first one, do all the configuration via the wizard. We have the connectivity when it comes to the cables, to the switches, and everything is there. This one, it's switched off until that I am done with the configuration here. Before I save, I will go to the second one and turn it on, right? So it will be discovered once that I save the configuration on the first one automatically. All right, so I think now it's the time that you can see this configuration. Okay, here I'm in my lab environment where I have two M370s. And as I said before that I already upgraded both of them to 12.7.1. The second one I reset it to factory default, and I'm gonna work here on the first one. It's kind of simple structure that I have, that it's only have an external interface and which is already have a static IP address assigned to it because it's in my lab environment, it's behind another firewall, so this is why it has that IP address. And also here I have the trusted interface and 10.0.10 network, and I'm going to choose later on the management IP address of the cluster to be in that network too, so that I can access it from the same trust network. Um, all right, so I already done all the cabling when it comes to the connection to the internal external switches. And now we're gonna start do the configuration. We're gonna go to the policy manager and we're gonna start doing the wizard. So once that I'm connected to the firewall, I'm gonna go here to FireCluster. Notice that there's setup and configure. Usually setup is available for the first time that you do the configuration for the cluster, or maybe you disabled it and you want to redo it again, then you can have this one enabled. But once that you do the configuration and it's in a cluster mode, you will see that it's going to be grayed out. So we're going to go through the step with the wizard. It will tell you here that you must have a member device of the same model, a feature key for all the members, a serial number of each member device that you have, and also a physical link on each that is enabled, physical interface that has to be connected so that we will do the synchronization. Once that we click next, this is where it's going to ask you if you're going to go with active, active, or active, passive. So I just want to show you the option with the active, active in here, that there is an option about the load balance method. Is it the least connection or the round robin? And after that here, when it comes to the active passive cluster, this is the one that we want to use. When it comes to the cluster ID, the standard here or default is 50. The main idea why we have it here, it's because in case that you want to have multiple clusters within the same subnet, right? If you want to do that to differentiate between them, then you're going to have maybe different cluster ID for the second one. Now, the next step that's going to ask you as far as cluster global properties is related to the cluster interface, right? So it's going to ask you, do you want to have a primary and backup? As you can see, that the minimum is to have one connection for the synchronization of the heartbeat, but it's recommended to have both. In my scenario, I already connected Ethernet 5 and Ethernet 6 to do the synchronization. This is why I'm going to choose both of them. And the interface for management IP address, I'm using the trusted in here to be able to do it. Then the next step, because this is the primary one, it will pull this information in case if you want to update it, if you have new feature key, then you can import or download this information related to the feature key for the first device. Once that I click next, it will tell you, okay, do you want to have a member name, right? And that's the serial number, just to make sure. For me, because I have them, one in the top of the rack, the other one is in the bottom. So maybe we'll say this is the first one. It's up, so that's I can differentiate in the name. The next step is going to ask you here, what's the cluster interface IP address? We will do first here for the first one, and then we're gonna do for the second one too, right? And we're gonna save the configuration so that it will be synchronized to both. So I'm gonna start here with the same information I showed you earlier. I'm gonna go with the 169.254 network, and I'm gonna go with the IP address here 5.1. So it's Ethernet 5, and this is on member 1/24. The backup it's gonna be 169.254.6.1/24. When it comes to the management IP address, I'm going to go with an IP address with the same range with my trust network. So I'm going to go here with 100/24. Okay. Now, this is the time that it's going to ask you, do you want to add another device to the FireCluster? Yes, you can choose no if you want, but for now, yes, I want to add another one. And that's the time it's going to ask you what is the feature key of the second one. So this is why it's always recommended to have it available. I'm going to go and grab that, and I'm going to paste the feature key in here, import, paste, and we're going to click OK. So this is the second one. It's going to ask you, okay, what's the name that you want to add in there, right? So this is going to be member 2 down, and I'm going to click next. So now it's going to ask us the same information about what's the IP address for the primary and the backup synchronization link that we have. Same thing, 169.254.5.2 here /24, and 254.6.2/24. And then I'm going to go with the management IP address of 10.0.10.102/24. Right. And after this, it will give you the summary. You can review the summary. We set the optional interface, which is 5 and 6 to be used for the purpose of the synchronization, and then information of member 1 and all the IP addresses that we assigned. Okay, click next. Now I'm going to click finish. This, once that we finish the configuration, it will show you what are the configuration that you have done so far, that the FireCluster is being enabled. I didn't push this configuration to the device yet. What are the members, in case you want to take a look at that, right? We have the information in advance that's related to the logging and notification, that if you want, you can set here the notification that it can send an SNMP trap or notification via email in case anything that is related to the firewall, that it's failing over from the first to the second. And also the member connectivity, that when it comes to the how many lost heartbeat threshold before that it fails over, to the second one. By default, it's 3. Definitely, you can increase it to 10 if you want to. It depends on the connection and depends on, the percentage of loss that you have in there. I want to do the option of monitoring the hardware status as a criteria for FireCluster failover, so that they will take the health into consideration. All right. So now after I done that, before I save this configuration, I'm gonna, I already have the connectivity for the second firewall, and it's been, reset to factory default, connected and turned on. Now I'm gonna save this configuration. And after it's being saved, until it's checking for a cluster, uploading the configuration. The configuration was saved successfully in this scenario. So now what we can do, we can go and check. Right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to the firewall with the management IP address. I'm going to close this one. And I'm going to open it again. All right, so as you can see now that there we have the cluster, it's been already formed. The cluster is active standby. I have member one, it's up and it's master. Second one now is idle. You give it, a couple of minutes, and then it will show up that it is the backup master. And also you can find out here the information that it's related to the IP address, the management IP address, the version of the operating system on that. So as you can see, it's already been updated that the second one is the backup master. So the whole configuration took less than 10 minutes. The main point is related to the connectivity that you want to do ahead of time. When it's active passive, it's actually less complicated when it comes to the routing and the switching. And the serial number that you have to have both of them. The operating system is up to date. Then it's going to take you around 10 to 15 minutes to do that. All right, so one of the things that you can do in here is related to the monitoring. So this is one of the place when it comes to the connectivity. You can actually open the policy manager for each one of them for the management purposes. But also we can actually highlight the first one here at the top, and we're going to go to FSM. Some of the information in here, if you want the details of it, you can go to generate your status report. I will do that in a second, but also the same information that is related to the cluster that's an active standby, which one is the master, which one is the backup, right? And all the interfaces in there. You can see now for Ethernet 5 and Ethernet 6 that both of them, they have the IP address assigned. There is a communication between the two. So we know that the synchronization is happening and the heartbeat is being sent over both of them. Now, when you click here on status report, give it a second until that is generated. You can do Control F and just look for cluster so that we can see what are the information that's available in there. So if in case if you want to know that the cluster is enabled or not. Right, so we know that for the log configuration, the cluster is being enabled. I'm gonna go here. There's the cluster snapshot. We are at the mode is active passive, the interfaces that is being used, which management interface is being used. The network mode is the router mode. And also the other information that's related to member one and member two, right? So this is something that you can do from here. Also at the same time that if you go under tools, but let's go first in the front panel here. And choose this. We have the tools. Under tools, we have cluster, right? If you just choose one of them, let's say member one, you go to tools, you go to cluster, right? Or even both of them in here that you can discover member, right? This is where actually you add the first one at the beginning, and after that you said no, and then you want to discover it later on, then you can do that, discover member. Failover master, you can reboot a member to see that process. So this is one of the processes that you can do it for the testing. You can do shut down the member and see the behavior in there. So you can actually do the failover master. So if I do that, it will ask me for the administrator password, and it is recommended definitely once that you set the clusters to test it. So let's do that. All right, the failover master device has been initiated. So the member one here, it used to be with the management IP address of 10.0.10.100. Give it a second until the failover that's going to happen. So you can see here at this side that the member one is the backup master now. We can refresh this. Okay, so another location that you can take a look at the information related to the cluster is in the web UI. So I already connected here using the web UI. And if we go here under system status, you will see that there is something called FireCluster. It will give you a little bit more information about the cluster, if it's enabled, for how long it's been there, the cluster ID. You can click on more details so that you can see all the information that is related to that. Also, it will tell you which one is the master, the backup, if they are online or not, how long is the uptime, the user's CPU, the memory in each one of them. Also, it will show some diagnostic related to the fire cluster status, the heartbeat is okay or not, the management interface, the primary cluster interface. Also, when it comes to the health index that we have here for the system, the monitor ports, the hardware, and the weight average for this device. Also, it's going to take you to the file objects where you can see that we have here the synchronization, right? For the configuration, the password, anything that is related to the services, right? And also you can see the event history, right? Up to the last 3 months. For the failover, I had here 3 failover that I initiate, a couple of them just for testing, right? And you can see here also the percentage when it comes to the cluster status, for both of them are up or one of them is up for how long. Right, so this is a little bit of an extra information in there. Another thing that I wanted to mention, definitely it's always recommended once that you do the configuration, is to take a backup for this cluster in case that you need to recreate it again so that you have the configuration for it. And also when it comes to the upgrade of the operating system, it depends on here if you're using WebUI or using the WSM. And there is a difference between connecting to the management interface, which is for each one of them individually, or that you're connecting to the IP address for the trust interface. Like for example, here I connected to 10.0.10.1, right? Not to 100 or 102, which is the management IP address. And in this scenario, if I want to do the upgrade, actually it will take the image and upload it to the master first. And after that, we do the upgrade for the master, and then the master will send a copy of that upgrade file to the secondary one, and then you're going to do the upgrade. But if you connect it to the individual IP address for the management, like 10.0.10, 100 or 102, and you upload you say that I want to upgrade, it will actually upload it individually, right? When it comes to the image of that operating system. Right, so this is when it comes to the monitoring and what you can do with WSM and WebUI. Another thing that I wanted to mention is related to the FireCluster. If you wanted to add it for logging or reporting in the cloud. So I'm going to show you here, if you go to WatchGuard Cloud and you wanted to add these devices. So I'm going to go to the location where I already have them, and I'm going to go under Configure Devices. Right? So it doesn't show up in here because I didn't add the devices yet for monitoring, and I can see both of them, the two M370s that I have. Please, when you click add, you add a FireCluster, not an individual device, right? So add a FireCluster, and that's going to take into consideration in case that one of them fails or available for a specific period of time, the other one is not. So I'm going to check here the first member that I want, right? And I'm going to add the second one. All right, now I have both of them in there, and I'm going to add the FireCluster. Once that I do that, it will have a verification code in there. I can go back to here, and I'm going to enable the cloud. WatchGuard Cloud, I'm going to enable it, enable the cloud. And after that, I'm going to save this configuration. there was an issue here because I am still logged into the web UI. Okay, so let me actually log out from here. All right. Save the configuration. That's the time they're going to ask for verification code that I got from the cloud. Say OK, and this is done. All right, as you can see here now, it came up online, and I can see that it's an active passive. It will give you the information about the name and the model for each one of them. You can reboot the device from here. You can fail over the master. These are some of the actions that is available for you when it comes to this device. I can go here now to monitor devices. Definitely it's going to take a couple of minutes to upload the information in here to the dashboard and the executive dashboard. But you can see here from the device summary, you have the information about both devices. All right, so that was the end of the demo and the end of our session for today. I hope that it was useful. I tried to cover as much as possible in this 1 hour or 50 minutes of the session. Definitely, please refer to the documentation that we have in the help site and in the support, that it will have much more information in there. There's a couple of videos on YouTube that also it's related to how to do the setup for the FireCluster. And at the end of the session, I just wanted to, ask you to scan this code and go to the link in case that you wanted to tell us, how we did today. I'm gonna wait for a couple of minutes for your questions, and definitely, if we don't have the time to answer them, I will reach to you later on personally to answer these questions. And one of the things that I want to point out in here, that in case if you missed this session, or maybe you had to drop halfway, you have also the option to watch this one in our YouTube channel. Now it's under WatchGuard Canada under YouTube. Usually it's uploaded between 7 to 10 days after this live session. Right? We're gonna wait for a couple of minutes. If there's no questions, thank you so much for attending. It seems there's one question here that is left, so it's related to can we actually have basic security or not as a license? Definitely the answer is yes. It's least, we have even some of them that can both be standard, but if you're gonna go with basic or total, one of them have to have the feature key for basic or total, but the second one, it always has to be in the standard. Right. Seems there's no more questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we're looking forward to see you again in the next session that we have for the next month. Thank you.